What are some ancient technologies scientists still can't explain? Story 1. Coral Castle is one of those stories that makes you feel like we're missing a page from the instruction manual. A heartbroken engineer disappears into solitude and somehow turns raw limestone into an entire estate. Walls, thrones, tables, sculptures, massive blocks placed with the kind of confidence people associate with the Egyptians. And the part that won't die is the how. Not just he moved heavy stones, but the precision, the fit, the balance, the clean cuts, the way certain pieces seem engineered, not just stacked. The legend thickens because he worked mostly alone, often at night, and didn't want an audience. People claim they never saw him doing the hardest parts. He spoke in cryptic terms about magnetism and the secrets of the pyramids, as if he'd cracked some hidden principle that modern people forgot. That's the kind of detail that turns a construction project into a myth. Sure, in theory, you can explain it with leverage, pulleys, tripods, counterweights, and obsessive patience. But that word, theory, is doing a lot of work. Because even if physics says it's possible, the practical reality of one person pulling off that scale, with that accuracy, with minimal documentation, still doesn't sit right in the gut. It's not that the stone floats, it's that the method vanished with the man. Story 2. Greek fire. An ancient weapon so effective, so feared, that entire fleets turned away at the sight of it. Used by the Byzantine Navy, this wasn't just fire, it was projected. Sprayed from siphons mounted on ships like an early flamethrower, hissing across the water before erupting into inextinguishable flame. Contemporary accounts describe enemy vessels engulfed in fire that could not be put out, even when they tried to douse it with water. That's the detail that unsettles people. It reportedly burned on water. In some accounts, it ignited upon contact with it. For centuries, the exact formula was a tightly guarded state secret. Only a handful of trusted individuals supposedly knew the recipe, and it was never written down in any surviving document. When the Byzantine Empire fell, the knowledge appears to have vanished with it. Modern historians speculate it may have contained petroleum, quicklime, sulfur, resin, ingredients that could create a sticky, floating, water-resistant incendiary mixture. Some combinations involving quicklime can produce heat when exposed to water, potentially triggering ignition. But speculation isn't certain. No verified recipe survives. No exact reconstruction has been confirmed beyond doubt. All we have are fragmented descriptions of liquid fire launched from bronze tubes across medieval seas. A weapon so advanced for its time that even now, its precise composition remains uncertain. And, sometimes, mystery burns longer than flame. Story 3, silphium, is one of those details from ancient history that sounds almost made up, like the kind of thing someone would slip into a historical novel and you'd assume it was exaggerated for drama, except it wasn't. It was real, and it was so valuable that the city of Cyrene literally stamped its image onto their coins, which tells you immediately this wasn't just some random herb people sprinkled on food. To the Greeks and later the Romans, silphium was basically a miracle plant. They used it for coughs, fevers, stomach problems, pain, inflammation, you name it. If you were sick, silphium was probably in the prescription. But what made it truly powerful and quietly revolutionary was that women used it as a contraceptive. In an empire obsessed with lineage, inheritance, and controlling bloodlines, a plant that gave women some say over pregnancy wasn't just medicine, it was leverage. And because of that, demand exploded. Merchants shipped it across the Mediterranean, doctors praised it, elites hoarded it, and it became one of the most sought-after commodities in the Roman world, supposedly worth its weight in silver. The problem was that silphium only grew in a very specific strip of land in North Africa and resisted cultivation elsewhere. So every harvest chipped away at a finite supply. Then, sometime in the early Roman Empire, it just disappeared. Over-harvested, possibly overgrazed, maybe environmentally fragile. Gone. One of the most valuable plants in history, erased not by war or disaster, but by popularity. Story 4. Archimedes' naval weapon is one of those stories that lives in the blurry space between engineering and legend, where the line between genius and myth gets thin enough to almost disappear. During the Roman siege of Syracuse in 214 to 212 BCE, the city was defended by none other than Archimedes. And according to later accounts, he didn't just rely on ordinary catapults and ballistae, he built something far more unsettling. The most famous device is what people now call the Claw of Archimedes, essentially a massive crane-like mechanism mounted on the city walls that could hook onto the prow of an approaching Roman ship, lift it partially out of the water, destabilize it, and then drop it back down hard enough to splinter wood and panic the crew. Imagine rowing toward a fortified city and suddenly the ocean itself seems to grab your ship and tilt it skyward. Even if the damage wasn't catastrophic, the psychological effect must have been brutal. Then there's the other weapon, the so-called heat ray. Later writers claimed Archimedes arranged polished bronze mirrors to focus sunlight onto Roman ships, setting them ablaze from a distance. Modern experiments suggest it's theoretically possible under very specific conditions, though wildly impractical in the chaos of battle. Still, the idea refuses to die, because that's the pattern with Archimedes. Even when physics can explain it, the scale and audacity feel disproportionate to the tools of the time. Rome expected a siege. What it got was a mathematician turning geometry into a weapon. Story 5. Damascus steel is one of those materials that feels like it belongs more to legend than to history. Blades with rippling, water-like patterns running through the metal, weapons said to slice through armor, hold an edge impossibly long, and bend without breaking. It sounds exaggerated, until you realize medieval warriors wrote about it with a kind of uneasy respect, as if they knew they were holding something rare. The name comes from the city of Damascus, where these blades were traded and admired. But the secret likely began much farther east with a material called Wootz steel. Through a precise mix of iron, carbon, trace elements, and controlled cooling, smiths created a structure inside the metal that gave it both hardness and flexibility, a balance most early steels struggled to achieve. The distinctive flowing patterns weren't decoration. They were a visible fingerprint of the internal chemistry. To outsiders, especially during the Crusades, it must have felt almost supernatural. Stories spread of swords that could cut lesser blades in half or slice a silk scarf midair as it drifted down. Maybe some of that was myth layered onto reputation. But reputation has to start somewhere. And then, sometime around the 18th century, the knowledge faded. Trade routes shifted, or sources changed. The craftsmen who understood the subtleties of the process disappeared, and the technique went with them. Modern scientists have studied surviving blades under microscopes, trying to reverse engineer what was once common knowledge. For a long time, it wasn't that Damascus steel was impossible. It was that the method had quietly slipped through history's fingers. Story 6. The Mayan calendar is one of those things people think they understand until they look at it for more than 5 minutes and realize it's not a single calendar at all, but a layered system of interlocking cycles that feels less like timekeeping and more like a machine. The civilization behind it, the Maya civilization, didn't just track days. They tracked time on multiple scales at once. The Tzolk'in ran on a 260-day ritual cycle. The Hab followed a 365-day solar year. Together, they formed a 52-year calendar round that repeated like gears meshing back into alignment. And then there was the long count, a linear system designed to measure vast stretches of time, not just seasons, but eras. That's the part that caught modern attention, because one long count cycle completed on December 21st, 2012, and somewhere along the way that rollover turned into a global panic. Headlines hinted at apocalypse. Documentaries leaned into mystery. People spoke about the end of the Mayan calendar as if the Maya had carved a countdown clock into stone and walked away from it. But the reality is quieter, and in some ways more impressive. The long count didn't predict an ending. It marked the completion of a baktun, a unit of roughly 394 years, and the turning of a larger cycle. For the Maya, time wasn't a straight line racing toward collapse. It was cyclical, rhythmic, constantly renewing. The date wasn't a stop sign, it was an odometer rolling over. What's unsettling isn't that they predicted doomsday, it's that over 1,000 years ago, they built a system capable of mapping time so far into the future that we're still catching up to it. And we mistook a reset for a finale. Story 7. OOP arts. Out-of-place artifacts. Are the kinds of stories that feel like they slipped into the wrong chapter of the timeline, objects or inventions that seem too advanced for their era, too refined for the tools we assume people had. And the torpedo story fits that mood perfectly. Long before modern submarines and naval warfare, there are accounts from the medieval Islamic world describing something that sounds suspiciously like an early torpedo, a rocket-propelled device designed to skim across water and explode on impact. The design is often attributed to Hassan al-Ramma, a 13th century engineer who wrote extensively about gunpowder weapons in the Islamic Golden Age. In his manuscripts, he described what he called a self-moving egg, essentially a metal or wooden casing packed with explosive material attached to a propulsion system powered by early rockets. Some illustrations show a device shaped like an egg or sphere, with stabilizing rods designed to travel across the surface of water toward enemy ships. Now, to be clear, this wasn't a torpedo in the modern sense. It didn't dive beneath the waves with guidance systems and internal engines. It was more like a rocket-assisted floating bomb. Terrifying, yes, but still bound to the physics and materials of its time. And yet, the idea alone feels ahead of its era, because we tend to imagine naval explosives as a product of industrial Europe, not something sketched in Arabic manuscripts centuries earlier. But the Islamic world was deeply engaged in chemical experimentation, pyrotechnics, and weapon engineering long before gunpowder reshaped Europe. So is it an OOP art? Not really. It's something more interesting. Proof that innovation doesn't move in a straight line, and that entire chapters of technological history get quietly sidelined until someone stumbles across a manuscript and realizes the future was tested long ago. Story 8. I read something from a lace makers guild once that really stuck with me. They said there are entire forms of lace that are basically lost to time. Not we kind of forgot the style, but genuinely lost. We have pieces of it preserved in museums, incredibly intricate, delicate patterns that clearly required insane skill to make, but no one actually knows the exact method anymore. The techniques fell out of fashion, demand dried up, and no new apprentices learned how to do it before the last masters passed away. That's the part that gets me. We assume that if something existed, we must know how it was made. But craft knowledge doesn't always survive in books. A lot of it lives in muscle memory. How tight you pull the thread, how you angle your hands, the order you cross the bobbins, the tiny adjustments you don't even consciously think about. You can document steps, sure, but that doesn't mean you've captured the feel of it. And lace isn't trivial. Some of those old European lace styles are basically geometry done in thread. Ridiculously complex, almost mathematical in precision. Someone had to invent that, refine it, perfect it. The guild has this line they repeat: every craft is within one generation of dying out. If the knowledge isn't passed down in time, that's it. The chain breaks. It's kind of wild to think that entire human skills, things that took centuries to develop, can vanish just because no one signed up to learn them. Story 9. I work at a lighthouse that has a first-order Fresnel lens made in 1870. It's 9 feet tall, 6 feet in diameter, and weighs 2 tons. It has been lighting the coast for more than 150 years and functions perfectly. In the 1980s, someone shot it with a high-powered rifle. Fortunately, the bullet did not hit any of the 60 prisms contained in the lens, but it did leave a hole in the glass that needed to be repaired. We had experts from the Smithsonian, NASA, and Disney, of course, check it out, and they all concluded, we don't know how this glass was made. It can't be duplicated. The Fresnel company agreed with them. Apparently, Dr. Fresnel had a secret recipe using precise amounts of sand from 13 French beaches. He never shared it before his death, and in 1944, the Germans destroyed the factory and its records when they withdrew from Paris. We put an acrylic patch on the bullet hole, and the lens continues to function as an active aid to navigation. Story 10. One of the weirder examples of lost craftsmanship is silk plush for antique top hats. Not the hats themselves, we can still make top hats, but the specific silk plush that gave 19th century hats that deep, almost liquid sheen, the kind that looks black until light hits it and suddenly it has depth. Apparently, the exact method for producing that long fiber silk plush was so specialized and so tied to a small number of workshops, mostly in France, that when demand collapsed after World War I, the knowledge just faded out. Top hats went out of everyday fashion, factories shut down, and the last people who knew the process retired or died without passing it on in a way that could actually revive the industry. And here's the strange part. Modern manufacturers can make something that looks similar, but connoisseurs can tell immediately. The antique plush has a particular density, a way the nap lies, a way it reflects light. It's subtle, but once you see it, you can't unsee it. That's why genuine 19th century silk plush top hats sell for a premium now. Not just because they're old, but because they're made from a material that effectively can't be recreated at the same quality. In England especially, there's a surprisingly serious economy built around restoring, trading, and maintaining these hats, especially for formal events where tradition still matters. It's kind of wild that something as specific as hat silk could become a lost technology, but it proves the same point. If a craft depends on demand and demand disappears, the knowledge doesn't slowly decline. It drops off a cliff. Story 11. This one feels almost cruel because it's recent enough that you'd assume we could just make more. We can't. The classic Hammond organs, the ones that defined mid-century gospel, jazz, and rock, got their sound from tone wheels, not software, not sampled presets. Physical, spinning metal discs shaped with microscopic precision so that as they rotated past electromagnetic pickups, they generated specific. It was electromechanical in the most literal sense, sound born from moving parts. When the original manufacturing operation shut down, the custom metal presses used to stamp those tone wheels were sold for scrap, just melted down. At the time, it probably looked like outdated industrial equipment taking up space. No one was thinking, this machine is the source of a sound that will define an era. In theory, yes, you could recreate it. Reverse engineer the dimensions, build new presses, set up precision machining. But the investment would be massive for a niche market. And attempts by hobbyists to craft tone wheels at home haven't been impressive. Tiny inconsistencies in shape or balance translate into audible difference. Analog systems are unforgiving like that. Digital emulations exist, and they're good. For most listeners, probably indistinguishable in a mix. But digital modeling captures behavior. It doesn't recreate the physical interaction of spinning metal, aging components, and mechanical drift. The slight irregularities, the way the instrument breathes, live in the hardware, so when the remaining original Hammonds finally fail beyond repair, that specific electromechanical voice, the one baked into decades of recordings, won't die dramatically. It'll just go quiet. Polaroid is a modern version of the same story, and it's kind of brutal because it didn't disappear in ancient history. It vanished in front of us. The original peel-apart and instant films weren't just clever chemistry, they were industrial ecosystems. The formulas relied on specific reagents, dyes, and minerals that were being mined at the time because other industries also needed them. Once those industries moved on to cheaper, safer, or more efficient alternatives, the mines shut down, and when the mines closed, the supply chain quietly collapsed. It's not that we forgot how to make the film, it's that the world that made it viable no longer exists. Polaroid's process depended on massive, specialized machines designed specifically to coat film layers at insane precision. Layers measured in microns, stacked with chemical pods that had to rupture at just the right pressure and spread evenly between sheets. When the company folded, much of that machinery was scrapped. And here's the part people don't think about. It's not just the machines that are gone, it's the machines that made those machines, the tooling, the calibration systems, the technicians who knew which dial to tweak when humidity changed by 2%. Could someone recreate it? In theory, yes. With enough money and time, but you'd be rebuilding an entire mid-20th century industrial infrastructure for a niche art form in a digital world. That's why modern instant film is an approximation. Impressive, nostalgic, sometimes beautiful, but chemically and mechanically different. And maybe the strangest part is that it didn't die because it failed. It died because the world optimized past it. Story 13. You'll hear that a lot, that we can't make violins as good as a Stradivarius. But the reality is a lot less mystical than the legend. The originals were made by Antonio Stradivari in 17th, 18th century Cremona, and they are undeniably extraordinary instruments. They're rare, historically important, and have been played and carefully maintained for 300 plus years. That alone gives them an aura. But when researchers have actually tested the claim in blind studies, where professional violinists play both Strads and high-end modern violins without knowing which is which, the results are surprising. In multiple experiments, players often couldn't reliably tell the difference. In some cases, they even preferred modern instruments for projection or playability. That doesn't mean Stradivari's violins aren't amazing. They are. The craftsmanship is elite, and small variables, wood density, arching shape, varnish composition, all influence tone. There are also theories about climate, the Little Ice Age wood growth, aging effects, and subtle material changes over centuries. But there's no solid evidence that the secret is lost. Modern master luthiers absolutely know how to build world-class violins. What we can't replicate easily is 300 years of aging, historical prestige, and the psychological weight of holding a multi-million-dollar instrument. In other words, it's not that we've forgotten how to make them, it's that the myth of Stradivarius has grown louder than the measurable difference. Story 14. The purpose of the bâton de commandement, a kind of common prehistoric object typically made with a material like antler, with examples found across much of Europe over the course of tens of thousands of years with one or more holes carved into them. There are a variety of plausible ideas. The oldest one, as the original name suggests, was that they were a mark of office, but more recently, a variety of more practical ideas related to rope making or as a device similar to an atlatl have been suggested, although it's difficult to conclusively prove which is true. Another is the Roman dodecahedron, typically made of bronze, brass, or another copper alloy, with almost all examples being a regular dodecahedron with holes of different sizes in the faces. Most examples date from the 1st to 4th century in western parts of the Roman Empire, particularly Gaul, but with a handful of examples elsewhere with over 100 examples found. No known written text or artwork refers to them, leaving us to do little more than speculate as to its purpose. Story 15. The Incan Quipu system is one of those things that feels like it's standing right in front of us, and yet just out of reach. The Inca Empire didn't use a written language the way we think of writing. No alphabet carved into stone, no inked manuscripts stacked in archives. Instead, they used chords, knotted strings arranged in precise patterns with variations in color, length, placement, and knot type. These were called quipus. At first glance, they look simple. A main cord with pendant strings hanging down, each tied with knots at specific intervals. But the deeper researchers go, the more complex it becomes. We know quipus were used for accounting, censuses, tribute records, storehouse inventories. The knots encode numbers in a base 10 system. That part is relatively well understood. What isn't fully understood is everything else. Some scholars suspect quipus may have encoded more than numbers, possibly names, categories, maybe even narrative information. There are Spanish colonial accounts describing Quipucamayokes, specialist record keepers, who could read these chords aloud, recounting histories and events. But after the Spanish conquest, much of that institutional knowledge was erased. Pipus were sometimes destroyed as pagan tools, and the people trained to interpret them were absorbed into a radically different administrative system. So what we have now are hundreds of surviving quipus in museums, physical artifacts without a living tradition to decode them completely. It's not that the system was primitive. It may have been sophisticated in a way we still don't fully grasp. And that's the unsettling part. An entire information system, tangible and preserved, that we can hold in our hands, but not entirely read. Story 16. The glass flowers at Harvard are one of those things that sound decorative until you see them and realize there's something else entirely. At Harvard University, there's a collection officially called the Ware Collection of Blaszka glass models of plants, but everyone just calls them the glass flowers. They were created in the late 19th and early 20th centuries by a father and son team of glass artisans, Leopold Blaszka and Rudolf Blaszka. And they are not simple sculptures. They're botanical specimens made entirely of glass. Petals, stamens, roots, even signs of disease and decay. Crafted with microscopic precision for teaching purposes at a time when preserved plant samples faded, shriveled, or lost their color. The Blaszkas developed techniques that allowed them to shape, stretch, and pigment glass into forms so accurate that even botanists have to lean in to remember they're looking at art, not living tissue. Here's the part that feels familiar in the lost craft sense. The Blaszkas worked largely in isolation, refining methods that weren't widely shared. When Rudolf died in 1939, their particular approach, the exact glass mixtures, lampworking techniques, and coloring methods, effectively ended with him. Modern glass artists are incredibly skilled, and similar botanical models can be made today. But replicating the Blaszkas' work exactly, with the same materials, the same internal structures, and the same near-clinical realism would require rediscovering subtleties that were never fully documented. So the glass flowers sit in their cases frozen in permanent bloom. Not just art, but a reminder that sometimes scientific progress depends on a craft so specialized that when the hands stop, the method stops too. Story 17. For the Dutch people in here, Trek drop. If you know, you know. Trek drop wasn't just licorice. It was that specific, almost tar-black dense, slightly salty slab you'd break or cut yourself. Sticky in the wrapper, stubborn in your teeth, the kind of candy that felt industrial in the best possible way. It had weight to it, resistance, a chew that lasted, and then it just stopped. Not because people suddenly hated licorice. The Netherlands still runs on drop. But the exact production methods for traditional Trek drop, the machinery, the formulation, the way it was pulled and stretched to get that texture, became impractical. Factories modernized, equipment was replaced, regulations tightened, ingredients shifted, and small batch labor-intensive processes don't survive well in a market that rewards efficiency. You can still buy drops, plenty of it, sweet, salty, double salted, honey, soft, hard. But old school Trek drop, the real stuff, the texture isn't quite there anymore. Either it's too soft, too uniform, or missing that dense elastic chew that made your jaw work for it. Could someone recreate it? Probably, with enough money, the right retrofitted equipment, and a niche market willing to pay for nostalgia. But that's the thing with these hyper-specific products. They rely on a chain of demand, machinery, suppliers, and tacit knowledge. Once that chain breaks, it's not just a recipe you've lost, it's a process. And sometimes, even in a country obsessed with drops, that process doesn't come back. Story 18. This is one of those topics where legend, archaeology, and metallurgy all get tangled together. Take the so-called Danish axes, the big two-handed Viking Age war axes you see described in the sagas. The texts make them sound almost exaggerated. Long shafts, wide blades, thin enough to be fast but strong enough to survive battle. When modern smiths try to match some of those proportions exactly as described, not impossible, we have surviving examples, but the balance between thinness, width, and structural strength requires very controlled forging and heat treatment. These weren't crude barbarian tools. They were precision weapons. Then there are the Ulfbert swords. These are the blades stamped with variations of the name plus ULFBERHT plus, dated roughly 9th to 11th century. Metallurgical analysis has shown that some of them were made from unusually high-quality crucible steel, low in slag, high in carbon, remarkably pure compared to most European steel of the time. In a period when bloomery iron was standard, that level of refinement stands out. That's where the mystery narrative kicks in. How are Scandinavian smiths producing steel that on paper looks closer to later medieval or even early industrial quality? The prevailing theory is trade. crucible steel moving westward from Central Asia or the Islamic world along river and trade networks. Not magic, not aliens, just long-distance commerce and very skilled craftsmen. Can we recreate them today? Absolutely. Modern metallurgy surpasses them easily, but reproducing them exactly as they were made, with the same materials, the same tools, and the same constraints, that's harder. Not because it was impossible, but because they were better at it than we used to assume. Story 19. I'm going to talk about something that's unique to my region. Back before World War II, and specifically the Odsun, the expulsion of Germans from Czechoslovak border territories from 1945-1947, the border regions of Czechia were famous for their glassworks. Each region has their own speciality and unique styles. My home region in southern Bohemia, specifically the former lands of the Bukoy family, were famous for their dark-colored hyolith and agath glass, while glass production is still ongoing in these regions. The expulsion of the German population has practically wiped out any chance of recreating the unique hues and colors that made the glass famous. The glass was used for both decor and utility, as it was used much like modern brown glass, protecting medicines sensitive to light. Really, this is a story you'll find with many people who were forced from their lands. Techniques of craftsmanship are tied to the land, be it in special resources or special needs. Story 20. There was a significant loss of kit or technology in Tasmanian prehistory. These likely included bone tools, cold weather clothing, hafted tools, nets, fishing spears, barbed spears, spear throwers, and boomerangs. The reasons for it, however, are disputed. It has mostly been attributed to a small population size resulting in certain technologies not being passed on and therefore forgotten. The alternate theory is that technology loss resulted from environmental change, making the lost technologies no longer necessary. Another factor is being cut off from populations where those technologies were still known. In Tasmania, this happened due to sea level rise, after the last glaciation increasing the distance between Tasmania and the mainland. Story 21. This is one of those inventions that sounds anachronistic until you look into it. Around 132 AD, during the Eastern Han Dynasty, the polymath Zhang Heng reportedly created what's often described as the world's first seismograph. Not something that predicted earthquakes, that's a modern misconception, but a device that could detect distant seismic activity and indicate the direction it came from. The descriptions say it was a large bronze vessel with 8 dragon heads arranged around its circumference, each holding a metal ball in its mouth. Beneath each dragon sat a toad with its mouth open. When an earthquake occurred, a mechanism inside the vessel would trigger one dragon to release its ball into the corresponding toad, signaling the direction of the tremor. What's fascinating is that the internal mechanism wasn't described in enough detail to fully preserve how it worked. Later texts referenced it, but over centuries the exact design was lost. By around 1200 AD, whatever practical knowledge remained had effectively vanished. Modern scholars have proposed different reconstructions: pendulum systems, inverted pendulums, lever triggers, all attempting to explain how such a device could respond to ground motion and release only one ball in the correct direction. In 2005, Chinese researchers unveiled a reconstructed model they claimed functioned successfully based on historical records. Whether it perfectly matches Zhang Heng's original is still debated, but the broader point stands. Nearly 2,000 years ago, someone conceived of a machine designed to sense invisible forces moving through the earth, and built it. And for centuries, we weren't entirely sure how. Story 22. There are probably only a handful of ocularists left who can still hand-make glass eyes the traditional way. And that's one of those facts that feels oddly fragile once you think about it. Making a custom glass prosthetic isn't just about shaping a sphere and painting it vaguely blue or brown. It's microanatomy and art fused together. The ocularist has to understand the structure of the iris, the subtle veining of the sclera, how light scatters through translucent layers, how moisture makes a living eye look alive instead of flat. The glazing has to be precise. The curvature has to match the socket. The weight, balance, and polish all affect comfort. A fraction off and the wearer feels it constantly. Modern prosthetic eyes are often made from acrylic using digital imaging and scanning, which is faster, scalable, and easier to standardize. You can manufacture them with impressive accuracy, but many patients and practitioners say the traditional hand-blown and hand-painted glass versions are still more comfortable, more lifelike, more present. There's a depth to layered glass that's hard to fake. The issue is scale. Training takes years. The market is small, and like so many crafts, the knowledge lives in mentorship. In studios, not textbooks. If only a few masters remain and not enough apprentices commit to learning, the skill doesn't gradually weaken. It just narrows. And then one day, it's not a common medical craft anymore. It's a specialty that almost no one knows how to do by hand. Story 23. Flintnapping is one of those skills that looks primitive until you actually watch someone do it and realize it's anything but. At a glance, it's just breaking rocks. Hit a stone with another stone, sharp edges appear. That's the stereotype. But real flint napping, the kind that produces symmetrical spear points, razor-thin blades, pressure-flaked arrowheads, is controlled fracture engineering. You're not smashing. You're directing force through crystalline structure, predicting how a shockwave will travel through the material and attach exactly the flake you want. And it's incredibly unforgiving. One bad strike, one misjudged angle, and the piece snaps in half. Hours of work gone instantly. There's no glue, no welding, no patching it back together. Ancient knappers understood platform preparation, angle of percussion, the difference between hard hammer and soft hammer techniques, and pressure flaking for refinement. They manipulated stone like it was responsive, because in a way it is, if you understand it. For most of human history, this wasn't a hobby, it was survival. Tools, weapons, scrapers, drills, entire cultures depended on people who could reliably turn raw nodules into functional edges. Then metal took over. Stone became obsolete. The necessity disappeared. The knowledge didn't vanish entirely. Modern flint knappers exist, and some are extraordinarily skilled, but the cultural ecosystem that once made this a common, essential craft collapsed. It's strange to think that for tens of thousands of years, this was cutting-edge technology. Now it survives mostly as demonstration, archaeology, or niche art. Same stone, different world. Story 24. The Pythagorean theorem is usually taught like it just appeared one day, stamped with the name of Pythagoras, neat and complete. But that's not really how it happened. Long before Pythagoras was born, civilizations were already using the relationship between the sides of right triangles. Babylonian clay tablets from nearly 1,000 years earlier show lists of number triples, like 3, 4, 5. That only makes sense if someone understood that the square of the hypotenuse equals the sum of the squares of the other two sides. They might not have written it as an equation, but they knew the pattern. In ancient Egypt, rope stretchers reportedly used knotted cords to lay out right angles for construction. In India and China, geometric texts describe rules equivalent to the theorem centuries before it was formally proven in Greece. What Pythagoras, or more accurately, the Pythagorean school, likely did wasn't discover the relationship from scratch. It was formalize it, prove it, turn a practical observation into abstract mathematics. That's the quiet shift that matters, because there's a difference between knowing something works and proving why it must always work. The theorem feels eternal now. It's printed on classroom walls, embedded in architecture, coded into software, but it wasn't born in a single flash of genius. It evolved across cultures, refined by builders, surveyors, and thinkers who were solving real-world problems long before the formula had a name. It's less a moment of invention, more a moment when humanity realized it could turn patterns into proof. Story 25. Dhaka Muslin is one of those losses that feels deliberate, not accidental. For centuries, Bengal produced a cotton fabric so fine it was described as woven air. European travelers wrote that a full-length sari could pass through a ring. The thread counts were staggering. The weave was so sheer it seemed impossible that it came from a plant in human hands. That plant mattered. The cotton used, Gossypium arboreum var. neglecta, grew in a specific climate along the Meghna River basin. The humidity, the soil, even the timing of the monsoon all played a role. The fibers were unusually long and fine, and the spinning was often done in the early morning when moisture in the air kept the thread from snapping. This wasn't just agriculture, it was an ecosystem tied to craft. Then the East India Company consolidated control over Bengal in the 18th century. Colonial policy favored British industrial textiles over local handweaving. Tariffs, coercive contracts, and market manipulation undercut Bengali weavers. Whether or not the more extreme stories are true, the economic damage is not debated. The industry collapsed, skills dispersed, generational knowledge broke. Over time, the specific cotton variety disappeared from cultivation. When researchers in Bangladesh attempted to revive Dhaka muslin around 2013, they had to work with a hybrid strain that matched only about 70% of the original plant's profile. Even then, finding artisans willing to commit to an incredibly labor-intensive process in a modern economy proved difficult. So the fabric wasn't lost because it was impossible. It was lost because the system sustaining it was dismantled. And once that happens, revival becomes archaeology. Story 26. The steam engine is usually framed as the clean starting point of the Industrial Revolution. Coal, pistons, factories, progress. But like most origin stories, it's messier than that. Long before smokestacks defined skylines, the ancient Greeks had already built a primitive steam device. The aeolipile, described by Hero of Alexandria in the 1st century AD, was essentially a hollow sphere that spun when steam escaped from angled nozzles. It worked. It demonstrated the principle. But it never became an engine in the industrial sense. It was more curiosity than infrastructure. Fast forward to the 17th and 18th centuries, and steam reappears with urgency. Mines were flooding. Industry needed power. That's when practical engines started to take shape. First, crude atmospheric machines like those of Thomas Newcomen, then more efficient designs refined by James Watt. The knowledge didn't re-emerge because someone rediscovered Hero's toy and said, "Let's build factories." It re-emerged because the economic pressure was there. That's the pattern you start to notice with lost or delayed technologies. The principle can exist for centuries. The physics doesn't change. What changes is whether society has the materials, the capital, the fuel supply, the incentive to turn an idea into infrastructure. The steam engine wasn't a single invention. It was a moment when scattered knowledge, industrial need, and available resources finally aligned. And when they did, it didn't just power machines. It rewrote the world. Story 27. The Eastern Agricultural Complex is made up of now extinct breeds of domesticated plants in southeastern North America. The wild species still exist, but the domesticates died out. The knowledge to domesticate plants, and particularly these plants, was lost during the adoption of corn, beans, and squash from Central and South America. Reliance on corn in southern NA became so monolithic that illness due to nutrient deficiency occurred among pre-contact Native Americans at times. It would have been akin to pellagra. Another example that comes to mind is Greek fire, although I have a feeling it's more of a scary myth rather than anything that actually existed. Story 28. A lot of Paleolithic stone tool techniques had to be reverse engineered from debris. That's the part people don't think about. We don't have manuals. We don't have master knappers explaining their process. What we have are finished tools and the waste flakes scattered around ancient campsites. Archaeologists look at fracture patterns, platform angles, ripple marks in the stone, basically forensic evidence, and then try to recreate the sequence of strikes that would produce that result. Some techniques, like Levallois core preparation, are so methodical that they feel almost algorithmic. The napper shapes the core in advance so that one precise strike releases a flake of predetermined size and shape. That level of planning happened tens of thousands of years ago. And for a long time, modern researchers couldn't fully understand how it was done until experimental archaeologists started breaking a lot of rocks and failing repeatedly. It's strange. Humanity used stone as its primary technology for most of its existence, and yet many of those exact techniques had to be rediscovered from scratch by studying the leftovers. And then there's the Inca Empire and their Quipu system. We still have surviving quipus, cords with knots arranged in deliberate patterns, and we know they were used for accounting, census data, and administration. We've decoded the numerical base 10 structure. But beyond that, it gets murky. Spanish chroniclers described specialists who could read them, possibly recounting histories or narratives. That interpretive layer is gone, so in both cases the artifacts survived. The literacy did not. And that's the unsettling theme. You can preserve the object and still lose the knowledge. Story 29, one of the most unsettling lost knowledge topics, isn't mechanical at all. It's biological. Plant domestication. We understand the outcomes. We can map genomes, trace mutations, identify selective traits. But the actual beginning, the moment humans shifted from gathering wild grasses to intentionally shaping them, is still murky. Take maize. Modern corn looks nothing like its wild ancestor teosinte. The transformation from a hard, sparse grass with a few encased kernels into the dense, uniform cobs we recognize happened in Mesoamerica thousands of years ago. Genetic studies show it requires specific mutations in key regulatory genes. But how did early farmers recognize those rare variants? How did they stabilize them without modern breeding theory? The process must have taken generations of observation and selection so patient it's almost hard to conceptualize. And then there's ginger. Cultivated ginger doesn't even produce viable seeds. It's propagated vegetatively through rhizomes. That means someone, at some point, selected and perpetuated a plant that effectively can't reproduce on its own in the wild. It survives because we keep cloning it. It's easy to say selective breeding, but that phrase hides the scale of experimentation behind it. Early agriculturalists were running long-term genetic trials without microscopes, without written theory, without knowing what DNA was. They were selected for taste, size, yield, storage, texture, all by eye and memory. We can replicate domestication now and even accelerate it with modern tools. But the origin moment, the first decision to intervene, the first recognition that traits could be shaped across generations, isn't recorded. It's one of the biggest technological revolutions in human history, and we don't know exactly how it began. Story 30. Lost wax casting is one of those techniques that never truly vanished, but quietly slipped out of everyday awareness. The process, also called investment casting, is elegant in its logic. You sculpt an object in wax. You encase it in a heat-resistant material like clay or plaster. You heat the mold so the wax melts and drains away, leaving a cavity. Then you pour molten metal into that space. When the mold is broken open, the metal object emerges, capturing every tiny detail the wax once held. The Romans used it constantly. Jewelry, small tools, fittings, and especially bronze statuary were made this way. If you wanted lifelike detail in metal, folds in fabric, strands of hair, subtle facial features, lost wax casting was the method. It didn't disappear after Rome fell either. In the Middle Ages, the technique was still being used, particularly for religious objects. One of the key figures preserving it was Theophilus Presbyter, who wrote on diverse arts in the 12th century. His text described metalworking, painting, glassmaking, practical fabrication knowledge written down deliberately so it wouldn't vanish with individual craftsmen. That part matters, because so much craft knowledge historically survived through apprenticeship, not documentation. Theophilus's work feels like an early recognition that techniques could be fragile, that if they weren't recorded, political collapse or economic shifts could erase them. Lost wax casting wasn't lost. It just became specialized, and unless you're a sculptor, jeweler, or industrial manufacturer, you could live your whole life surrounded by cast metal and never realize the ancient process still shaping it. Story 31. Ancient coins are my thing, and the Greek or Roman technology to mint coins was pretty much totally lost during the Middle Ages. Arguably, the most beautiful coins ever produced were done so between 480 to 200 BC. The Romans gradually lost the techniques to engrave tiny, detailed, and properly proportioned small figures and focused only on portraiture, which itself was slowly discarded between the 4th and 5th centuries. We know that the coin blanks were heated, which allowed for the striking of a much deeper design than is possible since, but we aren't really sure how they made doing so economical at the scale they did. Almost no ancient dies survive, and most that do were cheap copies used by forgers. The mints were usually adept at destroying their tools to protect their techniques and technology. In the early 1900s, President Roosevelt brought a Greek coin to the mint director and asked him to design a coin like it. Sangodins designed and made the high-relief double eagle, and told the president that it was so hard to make that they couldn't do any more. Some metals are struck in relief similar to ancient Greek coins, but never coins. Unrelated but still interesting, the alloy cupronickel, 25% nickel and 75% copper, was first used by the West in the late 19th century, nickel having only been discovered about a century prior. Nearly 2,000 years before that, the Greek kings in Bactria, Afghanistan, minted coins in cupronickel, known as white copper in China. Story 32. Roman dodecahedron. Archaeology has failed to determine a coherent, agreed purpose for these devices for 286 years since the first recorded example was found at Aston, Hertfordshire in 1739. That is, until now. In May 2023, I distributed a preliminary proposal for these objects, of which over 130 whole or partial have been found, but only in areas of Roman occupation of Northern Europe, including Hungary, Romania, and areas populated by Gauls and Celts. Many suggested uses have been suggested, but N1 have been accepted. As usual for archaeologists, when they are unable to come to a satisfactory solution, they fall back onto their usual response of a religious basis. The suggestion I propose is the only practical purpose that has not only the vast wealth of support from data already reported, but with logical arguments both for and against most suggestions using reported points, but also includes an outline procedure for testing this proposal with an acknowledgement it could be wrong, or if not absolute proof, but undeniable strength of evidence that could not be accepted. Story 33. Levitating huge objects with sound sounds like science fiction, until you realize acoustic levitation is a real, measurable phenomenon. Sound is pressure, literally waves of compressed and rarefied air. If you create a strong enough standing wave between two surfaces, you can form stable nodes where pressure balances out. Small objects placed at those nodes can hover, no strings, no magnets, just vibration holding matter in place. In laboratories, researchers have levitated droplets of liquid, foam, insects, even small solid beads using ultrasonic transducers. The frequencies are typically far above human hearing, and the objects are tiny, milligrams to grams. It works because at small scales the force required to counter gravity is relatively modest. The leap from that to huge objects is where the myth grows. To levitate something massive with sound alone, you'd need an absurd amount of acoustic energy. The pressure required scales with weight. Air would heat, structures would vibrate violently, and the energy input would be enormous. In practical terms, levitating something like a stone block with airborne sound waves isn't just difficult, it's wildly inefficient compared to mechanical lifting. That hasn't stopped the idea from attaching itself to ancient architecture theories. You'll sometimes hear claims that pyramids or megaliths were lifted with sound, but there's no credible evidence for that, and the physics doesn't cooperate at that scale. Still, the fact that sound, something intangible, can suspend matter at all is unsettling in the best way. It reminds you that forces we barely notice can, under the right conditions, hold objects in midair. Not magic, just pressure tuned precisely enough to fight gravity. Story 34. Nixtamalization is one of the clearest examples of knowledge being ignored, and people paying for it. In Mesoamerica, indigenous civilizations like the Aztec civilization and the Maya civilization didn't just grind maize and eat it, they treated it first. Dried corn was soaked and cooked in an alkaline solution, usually water mixed with lime, calcium hydroxide, or wood ash. This process, called nixtamalization, loosened the hulls, improved texture, and most importantly, chemically unlocked niacin, vitamin B3, so the human body could absorb it. It also increased calcium content and improved protein quality. When maize spread to Europe, Africa, and parts of the American South after contact, the crop came with enormous agricultural advantages: high yield, adaptable, storable. What didn't travel with it consistently was the processing knowledge. In many places, people simply milled and ate cornmeal without alkaline treatment. The result was pellagra, a niacin deficiency disease marked by dermatitis, diarrhea, dementia, and eventually death. Entire communities suffered from it in the 18th, 19th, and early 20th centuries. Doctors debated causes for decades before realizing the issue wasn't the corn itself, but how it was being prepared. The tragic part is that the solution had existed for thousands of years. It wasn't hidden, it just wasn't respected. Nixtamalization isn't complicated chemistry by modern standards, but it represents something bigger. Indigenous food science refined through generations of observation, encoded into daily practice. When that context was stripped away and the crop was industrialized without the process, the nutritional safety net vanished. The corn wasn't deficient, the knowledge was. Story 35. Granulation is one of those techniques that looks decorative until you realize how technically absurd it actually is. The Etruscans were absolute masters of it. They could create thousands of microscopic gold spheres, perfectly rounded, incredibly uniform, and arrange them into intricate patterns on jewelry. Then they'd affix those granules to a gold surface without visible solder. No messy seams, no obvious bonding material. Just delicate clusters of metal beads fused so cleanly they look grown, not attached. That's the part that puzzled modern metallurgists for a long time. How do you join tiny gold spheres to a surface without melting them into shapeless blobs? Traditional soldering leaves traces. Excess heat destroys the geometry. The Etruscans seem to be operating in a narrow thermal window with extraordinary control. The leading theory today involves diffusion bonding and possibly copper salts acting as a catalyst to lower the melting point at contact points. But for centuries in the West, the exact practical method was effectively lost. Medieval and later European goldsmiths produced beautiful work, but true Etruscan-style granulation at that microscopic precision largely disappeared. The skill wasn't impossible. It just required a combination of material knowledge and heat control that didn't survive intact through cultural shifts and workshop lineages breaking. Modern scientists became interested not just out of historical curiosity, but because the technique implies precise surface chemistry and microfabrication control, the kind of subtle thermal manipulation that overlaps with contemporary materials science. It's strange to think that 2,500 years ago, artisans were solving bonding problems at a scale that would later intrigue industrial engineers. Not with computers, with fire, salt, and patience. Story 36. The ability to move and lift massive stones, like the blocks of the Egyptian pyramids or the stones at Stonehenge, is one of those topics that constantly gets framed as lost technology, when it's probably more accurate to call it lost logistics. The Great Pyramid at Giza, built under Khufu, contains limestone blocks that weigh several tons each, with some internal granite beams weighing far more. And then there's Stonehenge, where bluestones were transported from Wales to southern England, long before modern machinery. It feels impossible because we imagine a handful of workers and primitive tools. But scale changes the equation. Ancient Egypt had massive labor forces, seasonal workers during Nile floods, centralized planning, and time. Lots of time. Experiments and archaeological evidence suggest sledges, lubrication with water, wooden rollers, earthen ramps, lever systems, and coordinated manpower could move astonishing weights. None of it requires anti-gravity. It requires organization. That's the piece that's hardest to picture. We live in a world where heavy lifting is done by cranes and hydraulics. We equate technological advancement with mechanical complexity. But ancient societies substituted mechanical power with human labor and clever physics, distributing force, reducing friction, building temporary infrastructure that was later dismantled. Is every detail known? No. There are still debates about ramp designs, quarry logistics, and construction sequencing, but the underlying physics isn't mysterious. What feels lost isn't a secret machine. It's the societal capacity to mobilize thousands of people toward a single architectural goal for decades at a time, without modern engines, but with relentless coordination. Story 37. Egyptian faience is one of those materials that looks simple until you try to define what it actually is. It isn't true ceramic, it isn't quite glass, it isn't stone. It's something in between, a silica-based material that the ancient Egyptians used to create amulets, beads, tiles, and small figurines with that unmistakable bright blue or blue-green glaze. For over 3,000 years, artisans in ancient Egypt produced faience objects with a luminous surface that seems almost modern. The color, often associated with the Nile, fertility, rebirth, came from copper compounds. But the real trick wasn't just the pigment. It was the glazing process. Egyptian faience can self-glaze. Under the right mixture of crushed quartz, alkali, lime, and copper, salts migrate to the surface during drying and firing. When heated, those salts form a glassy coating without the object being dipped in glaze in the way later ceramics were. There were multiple techniques: efflorescence, application, cementation, and scholars are still debating exactly how certain pieces achieved their finish. What's fascinating is that faience production spanned centuries, yet workshop-level details weren't preserved in written technical manuals. The knowledge was practical, passed down from artisan to apprentice. Over time, as glassmaking evolved and empires shifted, the exact formulations and firing subtleties changed or disappeared. We can reproduce science today. Chemists understand the ingredients, archaeologists have reconstructed methods, but the continuity, the unbroken tradition of makers refining it generation after generation, is gone. And that's the recurring pattern. The object survives. The hands that understood it intimately do not. Story 38. Maya blue is one of those materials that quietly humiliates modern assumptions about ancient chemistry. For centuries, the Maya civilization produced a blue pigment so chemically stable that it has survived tropical humidity, jungle exposure, and hundreds of years buried in soil without fading. Murals, pottery, sculptures, the color is still there, not dulled, not washed out. Blue. And not just any blue. The pigment was made by combining indigo dye from plants with a specific clay mineral called palygorskite. On paper, that shouldn't work the way it does. Organic dyes usually degrade, clays are inert, but when heated together under the right conditions, the indigo molecules bond at a microscopic level within the clay structure, creating a hybrid material that resists acids, solvents, and time. What's remarkable is that for a long time, scientists couldn't fully explain how it was made. The formula was lost after the Spanish conquest disrupted cultural continuity. The pigment still existed on artifacts, but the method was gone. It wasn't until the 20th century that researchers reverse-engineered it through chemical analysis and experimental reconstruction. Even now, there's debate about exact temperatures, preparation steps, and ritual contexts. Some evidence suggests it was used in ceremonial offerings, including those associated with sacrifice, which adds another layer of cultural meaning to the chemistry. The Maya weren't just mixing colors. They were engineering molecular stability centuries before modern materials science had language for it. Maya blue wasn't magic, but it was precise. And for a long time, we had the result. Brilliant, stubbornly blue, without fully understanding how it was done. Story 39. The Iron Pillar of Delhi is one of those artifacts that makes people pause, because it looks like it shouldn't exist in the condition it's in. Standing in the Qutub complex in Delhi, the pillar is over 7 meters tall and weighs more than 6 tons. It dates back to around the 4th or 5th century CE, likely erected during the reign of Chandragupta II of the Gupta Empire. And it barely rusts. That's the part that fuels the mystery. For centuries, people assumed there must be some lost anti-corrosion formula, some secret alloy that modern metallurgy couldn't replicate. But when scientists analyzed the pillar, the explanation turned out to be both subtle and impressive. The iron isn't stainless steel in the modern sense. It's actually relatively high in phosphorus and low in sulfur and manganese compared to later industrial irons. That unusual composition, combined with Delhi's semi-arid climate, led to the formation of a thin protective layer of iron hydrogen phosphate hydrate on the surface, essentially a passive film that slows further corrosion. What's remarkable isn't that it's immune to rust. It's that ancient Indian smiths were producing large-scale wrought iron of this quality at all. The pillar wasn't cast in one piece. It was forge-welded from multiple lumps of bloomery iron, hammered together while hot. That requires coordination, heat control, and material consistency at a massive scale. So no, it's not alien metal. But it is evidence that early metallurgists understood their materials deeply enough to produce something that would stand outdoors for over 1,500 years and still look almost intact. Not magic, just mastery and time doing the rest. Story 40. The Phaistos Disc is one of those artifacts that feels like it's actively withholding something. Discovered in 1908 at the Minoan Palace site of Phaistos on Crete, the disc is a small, fired clay object covered on both sides with spiral bands of stamped symbols. Not carved, not scratched in by hand, stamped, as if someone had a reusable set of glyph type and pressed them into wet clay before firing it. That alone is strange. It dates to the Bronze Age, roughly the 2nd millennium BCE, placing it in the world of the Minoan civilization. But unlike Linear A or Linear B, the scripts we associate with the region, the symbols on the Phaistos disc don't clearly match anything else. There's no bilingual key, no long archive of similar tablets to compare patterns, just the single object with 45 distinct signs arranged in a spiral. Over the last century, people have proposed everything: a hymn, a calendar, a game board, a ritual text, even a hoax. Most scholars treat it as genuine, but without parallel examples. Decipherment is nearly impossible. You can't decode a script from a single short inscription unless you already know the language family, and here, we don't. That's what makes it so compelling. It's not a ruined text. It's intact, fired, preserved, sitting in a museum, and yet it's silent. We have the symbols, we have the object, we even understand how it was physically made. What we don't have is the context, the linguistic and cultural framework that would turn those spirals into meaning. It's a reminder that preservation doesn't guarantee comprehension. Sometimes the artifact survives. The language doesn't. Story 41. Vitrum flexile is one of those stories that sits right on the edge between material science and myth. The tale comes from Roman sources, mainly Pliny the Elder and Petronius. According to the story, during the reign of Tiberius, a craftsman presented the emperor with a bowl made of a strange kind of glass. When dropped, it didn't shatter, it dented, like metal. The inventor supposedly hammered it back into shape, flexible glass. The legend says Tiberius asked whether anyone else knew the secret. When the inventor said no, the emperor had him executed, fearing the material would devalue gold and silver. It's a perfect story. Genius inventor, jealous ruler, lost technology. But here's the tension. No physical example of vitrum flexile has ever been found. No shard, no fragment, no workshop remains indicating a radically different glass formula. Roman glassmaking was advanced. They understood blowing, coloring, even some strengthening techniques. But nothing in surviving artifacts suggests a ductile, hammerable glass. Some scholars think the story was political satire. Others speculate it could have been an early form of tempered glass or a metal glass composite, misunderstood by observers. There are even modern parallels like chemically strengthened glass or metallic glass alloys that blur the line between brittle and flexible. Still, without evidence, vitrum flexile remains literary. Not confirmed lost technology, just a story about one, and maybe that's why it persists. Because the idea that Rome briefly touched a material ahead of its time and then deliberately erased it is more dramatic than the quieter truth that sometimes ancient writers just told good stories. Story 42. One that still fascinates engineers is the licorice cup. It's a 4th century Roman glass cup that looks green in reflected light, but when light shines through it, it glows deep red. Same object. 2 completely different colors depending on how it's lit. Licorice cup. For centuries, people admired it without fully understanding what was happening. It wasn't until the 20th century that scientists examined it under electron microscopes and discovered the secret. The glass contains tiny amounts of gold and silver nanoparticles dispersed throughout the material. Nanoparticles. At a scale of roughly 50 to 100 nanometers, metal particles interact with light in unusual ways, producing what's called dichroism, the shift in color depending on illumination and viewing angle. Today, we associate that with nanotechnology labs and controlled particle engineering. The Romans were achieving it in the 300 SAD. Now, to be clear, they probably weren't intentionally manipulating nanoparticles with theoretical precision. It was likely the result of extremely refined glassmaking practices, carefully controlled temperatures, metal additives, and experience passed through workshops. But the fact remains, they created a material effect that we only fully explained using modern physics. It's not that we can't reproduce it today. We absolutely can. What's striking is that the empirical craftsmanship required to pull it off existed without microscopes, without atomic theory, without spectroscopy. Just heat, sand, metal, and generations of experimentation. The object survived. The understanding came 1,600 years later. Story 43. One that still quietly baffles researchers is Roman dodecahedra. They're small, hollow bronze objects from the 2nd-4th centuries AD, found mostly in northern parts of the Roman Empire, Britain, France, Germany. About the size of a baseball, 12 flat faces, each with a circular hole of varying diameter, and little knobs on each corner. Roman dodecahedron. We have over 100 of them. We have zero written explanation of what they were for. No inscriptions saying this is how you use it. No depictions in art. No surviving manual. Just the objects themselves buried in fields, found in hoards, scattered across former Roman territory. Theories are everywhere. Measuring devices for surveying, tools for calibrating projectiles, knitting aids, candlestick holders, religious objects, astronomical instruments, dice for ritual divination. Some experiments suggest they could have been used to estimate distance based on hole alignment. Others think they were symbolic and had no practical function at all. What makes them compelling isn't that they're technologically advanced, it's that they're so ordinary in material, cast bronze, well-made but not extravagant, and yet their purpose is completely opaque to us. This was a literate empire. Rome documented taxes, laws, and military logistics, and still, something as tangible as this slipped through the historical net. We can replicate them easily. What we can't replicate is the context that made them make sense. Story 44. One that still raises eyebrows is the Nabatean water engineering at Petra. In the middle of a desert, in what is now Petra, the Nabatean kingdom built a city that could support tens of thousands of people. In a place with flash floods, seasonal rainfall, and brutal evaporation. They didn't just dig a few wells. They engineered a full hydraulic system. Rock-cut channels running along cliffs, ceramic pipes with tight joints, settling tanks, dams to slow floodwaters, hidden cisterns carved into stone. They controlled water pressure and flow across uneven terrain with gradients so subtle you can barely detect them. What's remarkable isn't that they moved water, it's how precisely they managed it. The channels were angled just enough to keep water flowing without eroding the system. Floodwaters that could destroy a city were redirected and harvested. Sediment was filtered out before storage. Some sections were even covered to reduce evaporation. When Petra declined and trade routes shifted, the system fell into disuse. Without maintenance, desert conditions reclaimed it. For centuries, travelers saw the carved facades and monumental tombs. But the water infrastructure that made the city viable was largely forgotten. Modern engineers studying the site have been impressed by the sophistication, not because it violates physics, but because it shows a level of environmental adaptation and hydraulic planning that feels startlingly modern. It wasn't a secret formula. It was a systemic understanding of landscape, and when the society maintaining it disappeared, the desert didn't need long to erase the proof that it ever worked. Story 45. One that still feels almost impossible is the construction of the Baalbek Trilithon. In the Roman temple complex there sit 3 limestone blocks, each weighing roughly 800 tons, placed with precision into a retaining wall. And in the nearby quarry lies the stone of the pregnant woman, an even larger block, over 1,000 tons, partially cut but never moved. These aren't pyramid-sized stones stacked gradually with many smaller units. These are single, monolithic pieces. The Romans were extraordinary engineers. They had cranes, pulleys, treadwheel hoists, and organized labor forces. But even by Roman standards, Baalbek pushes the upper limit of what we see elsewhere. The quarry is slightly uphill from the temple site, which complicates transport. The stones were cut, shaped, and positioned with minimal gaps. There's no credible evidence of lost anti-gravity devices or alien intervention, just massive logistics. Likely a combination of earthen ramps, rollers or sledges, lubrication, lever systems, and sheer manpower coordinated over long periods. But we don't have a surviving manual detailing the exact method used here. That's what fuels the fascination. It's not that physics can't explain it. It's that the scale is so extreme that even plausible explanations feel inadequate when you're standing next to an 800-ton block fitted cleanly into a wall 2,000 years ago. Not mystical, just monumental, in a way that forces you to recalibrate what ancient societies were capable of moving when they decided to. Story 46. One that rarely gets mentioned is Chinese south-pointing chariots. Long before magnetic compasses became standard, Chinese engineers had reportedly built mechanical vehicles that always indicated south. Not using magnetism, but gears. The device is often attributed, in later accounts, to Ma Jun during the Three Kingdoms period, 3rd century CE, though earlier versions may have existed. The idea was elegant. A system of differential gears connected to the wheels of a chariot would track how far each wheel turned. As the vehicle rotated, the gearing compensated so that a mounted figure on top continued pointing in the original direction, typically south. No lodestone, no magnetized needle, pure mechanical dead reckoning. If the system worked as described, it required a functional understanding of differential gearing over 1,000 years before such mechanisms became common in Europe. And that's where things get murky. The original devices didn't survive. What we have are written descriptions in historical texts. Later dynasties attempted reconstructions, some claiming success, others acknowledging difficulty. Story 47. One that still sparks debate is the Nazca lines. Carved into the desert plains of southern Peru by the Nazca culture, These massive geoglyphs, hummingbirds, monkeys, spiders, long geometric lines stretching for kilometers, were created between roughly 500 BCE and 500 CE. They're enormous, so large that you can't really understand them from the ground. The shapes only fully reveal themselves from above. That's why when airplanes made aerial viewing possible in the 20th century, the world suddenly rediscovered them. Technically, the construction isn't mysterious. The desert surface is covered in dark, oxidized stones. Move them aside, and the lighter soil beneath creates contrast. With simple surveying techniques, stakes, ropes, grids, large designs are absolutely achievable without flight. What's less clear is the full purpose: astronomical calendar, water rituals, processional pathways, sacred geography tied to mountain worship. Modern archaeology leans toward ritual and water-related interpretations, but there isn't one single, confirmed explanation that accounts for every line and figure. They weren't lost in the sense that we forgot how to scrape rocks. They were lost in meaning. The climate preserved them because the region is so dry and windless. The culture that made them didn't survive colonization intact. The context dissolved, so we're left with shapes in the sand. Massive, deliberate, unmistakably human, and still only partially understood. Story 48. One that doesn't get nearly enough attention is the Indus script. The Indus Valley Civilization, c. 2600–1900 BCE, built major urban centers like Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro, with grid planning, drainage systems, standardized brick sizes, clearly a highly organized society, and they left behind thousands of small seals and tablets covered in short sequences of symbols. We can see the script. We just can't read it. The inscriptions are brief, often 5 to 10 signs, usually accompanied by animal figures like the famous unicorn motif. There's no Rosetta Stone equivalent, no bilingual inscription, no long narrative text, and we don't even know for certain what language family they were encoding. Some scholars argue it represents a full writing system. Others think it might be a logosyllabic script. A few even suggest it may not encode spoken language at all, but function as a system of elite symbols or administrative markers. What makes it unsettling is that this wasn't a marginal culture. It was one of the major Bronze Age civilizations alongside Mesopotamia and Egypt. And yet, unlike cuneiform or hieroglyphs, its script fell completely silent. The cities declined. Trade networks shifted. The continuity broke. And now we have hundreds of carefully carved symbols that once carried meaning. Names, goods, titles, maybe even stories. But without the key, they're patterns. Intact, legible in form, unreadable in substance. Story 49. One that feels almost impossible is the Benin bronzes casting tradition at its peak. The Kingdom of Benin, in present-day Nigeria, produced thousands of extraordinarily detailed brass plaques and sculptures from around the 13th century onward. The relief work is intricate. Layered figures, textured garments, complex regalia, hierarchical compositions, all cast using the lost wax process. But here's what stands out: the scale and consistency. Entire palace walls were once lined with these plaques. The guild system in Benin City maintained highly specialized casters who refined techniques generation after generation. The brass itself often came from European trade manillas, bracelet-like currency, melted down and recast into court art. When the British punitive expedition of 1897 sacked Benin City, the palace was burned and thousands of bronzes were looted. The guild system was disrupted. While bronze casting continues in Nigeria today, and master artisans still work in traditional ways, the uninterrupted institutional structure that supported the height of that production was fractured. It wasn't that the physics of casting were lost, it was the ecosystem. Patronage, centralized authority, generational training, stable workshops, all of that matters when you're sustaining high-level craft over centuries. The bronzes survive in museums around the world. What doesn't survive in the same way is the intact cultural infrastructure that made that volume and refinement possible. And once that breaks, continuity becomes reconstruction. Story 50/1 that still feels strangely modern is the Minoan plumbing system. On the island of Crete, the Minoan civilization built palaces like Knossos around 1900 to 1400 BCE that included multi-story structures, light wells, and functioning plumbing. We're not talking about a simple drain, we're talking about terracotta pipes fitted together with tapered joints to control pressure, flush toilets connected to vertical shafts, stormwater drainage systems, and even what appears to be hot and cold water separation in some areas. The pipes were designed to narrow and widen strategically to maintain water flow and reduce blockages. Some sections used gravity-fed systems from elevated reservoirs. It wasn't primitive improvisation, it was planned hydraulic engineering integrated into architecture. And then, after the collapse of Bronze Age civilizations around 1200 BCE, Much of that infrastructure disappeared from the Mediterranean world for centuries. Later Greek and even some early Roman settlements didn't always match that same level of domestic water management until urban engineering redeveloped at scale. It's not that the principles were unknowable, it's that complex infrastructure depends on stable, centralized societies. When those collapse, maintenance stops, skills fragment, large systems degrade quickly. The ruins at Knossos show that nearly 4,000 years ago, people were building homes with plumbing many medieval Europeans wouldn't see again for millennia. Not lost because it was impossible. Lost because continuity broke.